One theoretical framework on human function is that we generally behave and make decisions under conscious control. Recent research, however, has begun to point to implicit biases, or unconscious mental processes, that play a large role in our everyday conduct. These implicit biases are fast, and they're based on instinct. They can also lead us to make judgments about other people or ourselves of which we are not consciously aware, but affect how we interact. So in the healthcare setting, for example, studies have explored this fundamental inconsistency between lower quality healthcare that minorities receive, despite the fact that most healthcare workers say they really value equality. Researchers have found that these disparities may largely be driven by unconscious biases, particularly in a field that involves high levels of stress. There are also startling examples of the effects of implicit bias in the workplace. In 2015, a landmark study was conducted by the National Bureau of Economic Research. They were attempting to explain what researchers termed the disability employment puzzle. Basically, statistics for those with disabilities are alarming.
As you can see here, for working-age people with disabilities, the unemployment rate is twice as high, and there's evidence that these people get lower pay and less training. To test whether this might be due to bias, researchers sent in 6,000 applications to advertised accounting positions, with fictional applicants, some who disclosed disabilities and some who did not. The fictional applicants with disabilities received 26% fewer expressions of employer interest.
So what can we do to reduce this bias in medicine and in the workplace? In the psychology literature, there's actually some evidence that meditation can help. Over the past few decades, the concept of mindfulness has become increasingly mainstream, and studies have associated the practice with health, longevity, and productivity. And in Buddhist traditions and the derived secular movement, there's another essential practice that often accompanies mindfulness meditation, which is the loving-kindness meditation. It involves an effort to cultivate feelings of compassion towards the self and others. Some initial studies have actually shown some positive results for attempting to reduce implicit bias through both forms of meditation. Kang, Gray, and DeVideo in 2014 showed that a 6-week loving-kindness practice could decrease implicit bias against homeless people and Black people. In 2015, Luke and Gibson demonstrated evidence that just a 10-minute mindfulness meditation could lower activation of bias against Blacks and elderly people. These studies suggest that meditation should at least be explored as an approach to the crucial and elusive issue of reducing implicit bias. So we decided to extend the previous research by looking at whether and how a 15-minute mindfulness meditation and a 15-minute loving-kindness meditation would influence implicit bias, in this case against people with disabilities. So this is me here pretending to meditate. My name is Ty Bendit. I started this research about a year ago under the guidance of Dr. Sigal Barsade, who's the Joseph Frank Bernstein Professor of Management here at the Wharton School, and Dr. Andrew Hafenbrack, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Católica Lisbon School of Business and Economics in Portugal. We hypothesized that both the mindfulness induction and the loving-kindness induction would reduce implicit bias by acting through divergent pathways. So here you see the 3 inductions. The mindfulness induction, we believe, would act through lower negative affect, increased temporal focus, and less focus on the self to lower implicit bias. The loving-kindness induction would act by increasing compassion and increasing positive affect, with the same end result to lower implicit bias. The mind-wandering control was meant to replicate a baseline effect and would leave implicit bias unchanged. To test this, we conducted a lab experiment in the Wharton Behavior Lab in January of this year. Over the course of 4 days, 224 participants took part in the study. Upon entering the lab, they were seated at an individual workstation with a computer and headset. The program then randomized these participants into 3 groups: the loving-kindness group, the mindfulness group, and the control group. Each listened to a 15-minute induction. Following the induction, each participant took an implicit association test, or IAT. This is a test that was developed by Greenwald, McGee, and Schwartz to measure levels of implicit bias, in this case against people with disabilities. We custom built an IAT into Qualtrics for the experiment, and it works as follows. Participants are presented with an image representing disabled or abled, or words representing good or bad. They need to classify them into the appropriate categories by clicking I or E as quickly as they can while making as few errors as possible. Here I see a man in a wheelchair that would be disabled, I'd hit the E key. Lucky, that would be good, the E key. Abled, a man walking, I. Happy, E for good. Let's say I made a mistake. I associated this guy with good because of some implicit bias that I had. I would hit E, and it would throw an error, which I would then have to correct. After the IAT, participants were presented with a set of survey questions to measure the effect of inductions on cognitive and emotional variables. These included state affect, compassion, trait empathy, and interpersonal measures. Participants also answered questions related to explicit bias and disability-related demographics. After collecting all the data, we ran statistical analyses to test our hypothesis about the effects of mindfulness and loving-kindness meditation on implicit biases and the mediators. Due to a programming error with the IAT, we had to discard Monday's data, but kept Tuesday to Thursday's data, which had 164 participants with more than 50 in each induction group. So let's take a look at some of the results. So the first thing we looked at were the manipulation checks. These are sets of questions intended to measure whether or not the inductions produced intended effects. Here we have the mindfulness manipulation check. These are questions intended to measure reported levels of mindfulness post-induction. We see that here the participants in the mindful group had the highest levels of reported mindfulness, followed by participants in the loving-kindness meditation group, and finally participants in the mind-wandering group.
There was also a significant result for the loving-kindness manipulation check. Here, participants in the loving-kindness group reported the highest levels of this feeling post-induction, followed by those in the mindfulness group. The final manipulation check was this other-oriented manipulation check, which measures how much people's thoughts are focused on others as opposed to themselves at the end of the meditation. You can see in the loving-kindness group there was the highest levels of focus on others, significantly different than both the mind-wandering and the mindful group. And the mindfulness group has the lowest levels of focus on others, although only marginally significantly different from the mind-wandering group. After the manipulation check, the first thing we looked at were the overall bias scores, DBIEP, by induction group. These scores range from 0, which would be no bias, no association between disabled bad, abled good, and high bias here, strong association between disabled bad, abled good. We were unable to show a statistically significant difference of overall bias scores by group.
We did see that male-identified participants had a higher implicit bias set point than females, as shown by this blue here, and that they were affected differently by the inductions, shown by the cross.
One of the most interesting findings was that participants in the loving-kindness group had significantly lower error rates on the implicit association test than participants in the control group. This is indicative of lower implicit bias. As you saw in the demonstration of the IAT, most of the error occurs when participants need to match disabled and good, and then abled and bad on the other side and make a mistake. So this finding suggests that these participants were better able to overcome the biases that arose to select the correct response. We predicted that state compassion would be increased by the loving-kindness meditation, and indeed, state compassion was the highest among these participants, followed by participants in the mindfulness group and participants in the mind-wandering group. We also saw an effect for state pleasantness. It was higher in both the loving-kindness group and the mindfulness group than the mind-wandering group, and statistically significantly so. If we go back to the effect of the loving-kindness meditation group on error rates, we saw that this decrease was actually mediated by both state compassion and positive state pleasantness. We hypothesized that the LKM meditation would have a greater effect on compassion than empathy, and that this compassion would lead to a reduction in implicit bias. Indeed, although the LKM meditation led to the highest reported levels of focus on others, as you can see here through the other-oriented manipulation check, these participants reported lower levels of inclusion of other and self than participants in the other two groups, with a p-value of 0.04. So this finding supports our hypothesis that the LKM works through compassion, feeling for the other, rather than through empathy, which is feeling with the other. When looking at the relationship between disability-related demographic factors and bias scores, we found that people who had family or friends with disabilities or learning difficulties had lower levels of both implicit bias and explicit bias. These participants may in fact have had many positive associations with disabled people. In fact, the only participant out of 164 who had a significant bias in the opposite direction in favor of people with disabilities was in this category, right here. A further analysis of explicit bias scores, which were calculated based on a set of survey questions, showed that people higher in trait compassion and trait empathy had significantly lower levels of reported explicit bias.
So we know it probably can't hurt to do a little bit of this, or a little bit of that. But can a mindfulness meditation or a loving-kindness meditation really reduce implicit, unconscious bias? And if so, how do they work? These were the questions that we attempted to address through our experimental study in the Wharton Behavior Lab. We did find evidence that the loving-kindness meditation could significantly reduce error rates on an implicit association test, which is one indicator of lower implicit bias, and that state compassion and positive state pleasantness mediated this effect. We also found that even short 15-minute inductions could produce intended states of mindfulness and compassion and modulate how individuals relate to others. So, although we were unable to demonstrate an overall reduction in implicit bias scores, we did find some supportive evidence, particularly for the loving-kindness meditation. And we encourage future research on both these short-form meditations as well as longer periods of training to try and tackle implicit bias. Thank you so much for listening.